I wanted to talk about the music of Nick Drake, which I recently discovered, thanks to an excellent video by a chap called Charles Cornell, who does an excellent analysis of one of Nick's songs from the album Five Leaves Left. And this was my introduction to Nick. I'll link to the video because it's really good. It sort of breaks down the music theory elements that are at play in Nick's song Riverman. But I was so impressed by the music, by the song itself as well. Thank you to Charles for bringing that to my attention. That I decided, I need to find out more about Nick Drake and find more of his music because it was hauntingly beautiful. Kind of in the folk mode of the time, probably sitting quite similarly to John Martin, who I understand Nick Drake was friends with, John Martin. But yeah, it's quite a sad case with Nick, having found out a little bit more about him, because he was unappreciated really in his time. He was not successful as a musician, to say the least, during his life, which was tragically cut short when he overdosed on antidepressants at the age of 26. And he struggled with mental health and depression and anxiety, feelings of isolation and numbness throughout his life, and had a stint on antidepressants and then would go off them because he reportedly found that they sort of got in the way of him writing songs, so he'd come off them to write songs, but then he would spiral, so then he would go back on them, and this became like a vicious circle for Nick. So in many ways, Nick Drake was sort of his own worst enemy from that perspective. But his songs and his music were absolutely fantastic. Having gone through and listened to his 3 albums, Five Leaves Left, Brighter Later and Pink Moon, as well as some other recordings that are out there from later on that never really materialized as a proper album. Absolutely incredibly, just hauntingly beautiful. I think that's the one phrase that I would come back to in terms of describing Nick's music. But Nick was born in Burma in 1948 to reasonably well-off parents. He had a good upbringing. His mother and father both were musical, and particularly his mother you can find recordings of Molly Drake, and you can hear the similarity in terms of Nick's music and his mother's. But he went to Marlborough College and had some musical development there. He learned to play various instruments, and then later went on to obtain his first guitar. And from reading what little I have about him, it sort of seems that music was his refuge. He was notoriously quite mysterious and reclusive by some accounts. I mean, other accounts sort of talk about him, being quite earlier on being quite present and active in the sort of social circles of the time, but also noting that he would be someone who would turn up at a place and not really say much. But he would sit and play the same riffs on his guitar, and his guitar playing on all of his records is so impressive. It's just like a machine in terms of, not to rob it of its sort of beautiful quality, but it's very, he never misses in terms of like timing and just general feel, and he has this really soothing like baritone voice. It's sort of like meltingly gorgeous when you hear him sing on the records. But yeah, he later went to Cambridge, where he sort of got a little bit more into he didn't really apply himself by all accounts, and he ended up dropping out of Cambridge because he was spotted by, I think it was, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I think it was someone from Fairport Convention who saw him playing while he was at Cambridge. He was playing at a gig, and then he got picked up by producer Joe Boyd, who was blown away by Nick, and then basically said, you know, I want to make a record. So Five Leaves Left was made over the course of like a year, from what I've read, because he would sort of record it, you know, in bits and pieces here and there while he was still at Cambridge before he eventually dropped out. But Five Leaves Left came out in 1969, wasn't successful, and they tried to send Nick on tour, but because of his various issues with shyness and with being sort of a more withdrawn individual, he didn't really have the stage presence, from all accounts, to command the presence of the audience or tell people to be quiet if they were talking over him. And apparently there would also be like long gaps in between songs where he would retune the guitar, because all the songs had like different tunings, which is another interesting point to mention actually about Nick, is that a lot of his songs don't use standard tuning. They're in various different tunings that give them this otherworldly quality in terms of the way that the chords are structured and voiced. So, but it just didn't go well from, you know, trying to tour. So beyond that, Island Records, who had him on their roster, didn't really have much else to work with in terms of promotion. And they tried to do like ad campaigns in magazines and things, but it was never enough. And so without any, you know, solid touring or promotion behind any of these records, you know, first Five Leaves Left and then Brighter later, and eventually Pink Moon, they just didn't really reach audiences at all. Since then, they've gone on to become, you know, well loved by people. He's got a bit of a, I don't want to say cult following. I mean, I think it's just more the fact that there's been a lot of musicians that have been influenced by Nick over the years, and certainly his relationship with John Martin. John Martin actually wrote a song about Nick in 1973, which a little bit after Pink Moon came out, Solid Air, the song Solid Air, which was a bit of a tribute to Nick, sort of reflecting John's concern, because Nick was in a deep depression at that point. So lyrics in the song like, I don't know what's going on in your mind, but I know you don't like what you find when you're moving through solid air. So I think over time, over the years since Nick passed away, there have been various uses of his music, and most notably, I think there was I want to say it was a Volkswagen commercial. There was a car commercial, might have been Volkswagen or something else. I can't remember which it was, but that popularized the song Pink Moon from the album Pink Moon, and that then led to a big interest in Nick's music. People ringing up dealerships not to ask about the car, but to ask about the song, which is, you know, it's quite comforting. You know, it's a nice sort of footnote to Nick's story. It's sad that he never really lived to see the success of that, and I think there's a certain tragic element to the fact that he wasn't able to get the support that he needed while he was alive. It comes across from the things that I've read, which is not all that much, but it does sort of come across that people weren't really sure how to help him, beyond, you know, sending him to doctors to get prescribed onto antidepressants. So yes, there was I read about an interaction he had with Joe Boyd, where he got pretty bad, and he'd gone to him one day and he'd basically said, you know, why have you led me on this path of thinking I can have a career in music? Why haven't the records been successful? You know, you tell me I'm great, but yet nothing happens. Why? And that sort of speaks to a little bit of how numb and isolated he must have felt at that point, and disappointed because it must have been tough for him because he was surrounded by all these people telling him, your music is incredible, and yet it wasn't reflected in success. He ended up having to move back in with his parents, and he took a job. I think it was like a computer coding job at some point to try and support himself, but he couldn't. And I think he felt sort of ashamed about having to move back at home, but he just couldn't hack it anywhere else, famously. So, but in terms of the music, I went off and listened to Five Leaves Left, and just from the opening of that album, a song called Time Has Told Me, the playing is so good. There's a wonderful feeling about that introductory song, then into Riverman, and then through to hauntingly beautiful songs. I keep saying that about Nick's music, but it is songs like Fruit Tree, where he sings about like fame is but a fruit tree, so very unsound. There's a lot of sort of self-reflection and honesty in his music, and it's sort of raw and real, which is something that I really respect. But yeah, that Five Leaves Left it had string accompaniment and some electric guitar in there, but it was heavily like an overall acoustic sound led by Nick's guitar playing. And then when that didn't work, the following album, Joe Boyd decided with Island to invest in trying to get a more radio-friendly sound for Nick with the album Brighter Later. So on that album, there's a lot more guest musicians and a lot more, like, there's things like horns and drums, which creates more of a sort of almost not pop, but radio-friendly rock, I guess, or folk rock. But the songwriting is still astounding, and I don't actually mind the production quality of that, even though it sort of clashes slightly with Five Leaves Left in terms of the vibe. I think Nick makes it work really well. Some beautiful songs on that record, like Hazy Jane and Northern Sky. The Chime of the City Clock, I love. A fantastic album again. Some really good instrumental stuff as well, and I believe Nick would sing parts to players at various times. I think he did that on Riverman as well with the strings. He would sing sort of parts to get across what he would want for the orchestration. So yeah, Brighter Later, different sound, but still fantastic record. And then I think Pink Moon is the one that hits the hardest, really, because it's so raw and real. It was sort of it was recorded in 2 days by Nick without the knowledge of anyone at Island. They didn't know he'd gone in to record, because artists at that point had access to the studio, but they would pay out of pocket for it. So I think he wanted to do it on his own terms. At that point, he was at probably one of his lowest points when he made it, and reportedly the engineer, what was it? I can't remember the engineer's name now, but he reportedly, Nick just faced the wall and just played the guitar and sang into the microphone, and that was the album. There's no other instrumentation on there apart from piano overdub on the song Pink Moon, and then everything else is just Nick and the guitar. And yeah, he recorded it in 2 days basically, and then dropped the master tapes off at reception at Island Records. They didn't really realise what it was until much later, and then when they realised what had happened, obviously then they put it out. Now famous cover art, but I think the thing for me that makes Pink Moon work so well is, well, I mean, just like all of his records really, but the fact that it is that thing of just Nick and the guitar, and it's really personal. It doesn't have the artifice of the orchestrations or the production that was on the previous records. It is literally almost like a confessional situation, but he's got some great imagery on there. Even just the song Pink Moon, talking about the idea of the pink moon as a harbinger of fate, like death. No one can escape the pink moon. It's going to get you all. So you might be, you might have things that I don't have, or you might try to get something over on me, or the world isn't fair to everyone. But it almost saying that, well, it doesn't matter because the pink moon is the great equalizer. No one can escape it, and it takes all of this away from us. Ultimately, at the end, we all succumb to the pink moon. Really apocalyptic, but just reflecting where his head was at, I think, at that point. Songs like Horn, just beautiful guitar playing, Things Behind the Sun. But then going through to the closing track on Pink Moon, From the Morning, there's almost like a hopefulness, because there's a lot of brooding kind of introspection on Pink Moon, but a lot of it is quite negative, but it's honest and real, and I think that's what makes it work as a record. But the final track, From the Morning, there's a certain hopefulness about it. It's sort of I would say it's kind of restrained hopefulness. He's basically saying, now we rise from the ground, a new day, and we go and we run along the play the game, and we go along the coloured ways. It's sort of reflecting like a rebirth, I think, or hopefulness for the future, even if it is sort of delivered quite timidly by poor Nick at this point, who's at a loss with what to do. So I believe he went in and just recorded after the studio in the evening over 2 nights, while after the studio had become free from other artists going in, and no one. It was just him and the engineer. All 3 records, incredible. If you haven't heard them, go and check them out. And then the other resources that are out there in terms of things that I noticed and found in terms of Nick Drake. There's a video from a great documentary that's got a lot more info about Nick, called A Skin Too Few. You can find that on YouTube. I'll link it in the description below. And then there's also, I think it's fairly recent, there's a biography called Nick Drake, The Life, which I believe is sort of like the definitive. It's got a lot of interviews with people who knew Nick, probably more than has ever been collected previously, with input from his sister Gabrielle. And I haven't read it yet, but I'm definitely going to be checking that out. And then also, I think it's fairly recent that the Island have released. I think it's Island anyway, but you can go and listen to the making of 5 Leaves Left now as well, where you can sort of hear Nick in the studio talking through the process of how the songs are developing on 5 Leaves Left, and various different demo versions of songs that would later get changed. So it was quite an interesting listen for the hardcore enthusiast of Nick. But I think overall it's just it is a sad story, and the emotion in terms of what he was feeling really just comes through in his music. And there's not a lot of video. There's no video really of Nick, or there isn't at all, sorry, of Nick as an adult. There's very few photographs of him. He was really reclusive. But I like to think that now that his music is widely, well, maybe not that widely, but it's definitely got a big following now, particularly in like the more folky side of the music scene today. So I think he would, at least I'd like to think that he would smile to see that happening. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about Nick for a little bit and recommend that you go and check out his music. And if you enjoy Nick Drake and you've already become familiar with his music, let me know what you think and what your favourite songs are of Nick Drake. All right, peace out.